Please be seated. The court is now back in session. The floor will be given to Nguyen Chi's defense to put questions to this witness. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good morning to everyone in and around the courtroom, and especially good morning to you, Mr. Koon Kim. Thank you for being with us today. My name is Jasper Pauw. I'm the International Counsel for Nguyen Chia, together with my national colleague, Mr. Son Arun, and I will be asking you questions relating to your earlier statements to the OCIJ and to the DC CAM representatives. I will try to speak slowly for the benefit of the translators, and my first questions will relate to the period before the fall of Phnom Penh in 1975. You have stated that before Phnom Penh fell, there was heavy fighting and there were heavy casualties on both sides. Can you give us an estimate as to for how long you were actually in combat before you liberated Phnom Penh?
Before the final attack on Phnom Penh, as I said earlier, initially I was a messenger to carry rice supplied to the front battlefield and messages between the front and the rear. And sometimes when I was carrying rice to the front battlefield, I noticed the gunfires and shelling. So I spent my life as a messenger for 2 months, and later on I was assigned to the front battlefield. And it took about 2 months for the battle in order to finally attack and seize the Phnom Penh. At that time there were bombardments, aerial bombardments and armored tanks. And I was at my spearhead, and during the surge of the attack by soldiers, there were casualties. Each time there were between 20 to 30 casualties, and that's how I observe at my direction or spearhead.
And do you know who conducted the aerial bombardments of your troops?
At that time, I knew and I was told that the planes were the U.S. planes which were given to Lon Nol side.
And while you were in battle, did you find out what the Lon Nol soldiers would do with Khmer Rouge soldiers that were captured? Did you, for example, see what happened to them?
I could not grasp the situation whether the Lon Nol captured the Khmer Rouge soldiers or the Khmer Rouge soldiers captured the Lon Nol soldiers. Could you be a bit more specific?
I will try to clarify. Did you see or did you experience whether or not the Lon Nol soldiers ever captured Khmer Rouge soldiers?
During the battlefield, I did not see if any of the Khmer Rouge soldier was captured by the Lon Nol side. because the Khmer Rouge soldiers were absolute. If any of them were captured by Lon Nol, they believed that they would be tortured. So for that reason, they fought till their deaths rather than being captured alive.
And another question relating to the battle before Phnom Penh fell. Let me rephrase that question. I will drop that question and move on to the next topic. And we are now speaking about orders that you may have received before Phnom Penh fell. And on the case file, there is an interview with Mr. Heng Samrin, with Mr. Ben Kiernan, dated the 2nd of December 1991. And for the reference, the E3 number is E3/1568. English ERN is 00651886. And Khmer ERN is 00713958. Just by way of introduction, Heng Samrin commanded a division of the East Zone that arrived in Phnom Penh on April 17 in the morning. And he has spoken to Ben Kiernan about his experience during the conquest of Phnom Penh. But my question relates to the period before that, and I will quote a statement by Ms. Heng Samrin about this period. And I quote, "At that time, we received plans from the center, from high levels, just to engage in production after liberation, to grow rice, to support ourselves, and under no circumstances to ask the population for anything. The army had to support itself, work hard to grow rice and plant other crops to support itself. This was the orders to the army." So we worked hard, and in my division we planted crops and vegetables and even gave some to the people to eat as well. End of quote. My question to you, Mr. Kun Kim, is did you receive similar orders? Did you receive orders to not ask the population for anything?
President, witness, please wait. The prosecution, you may proceed.
Your Honours, we would object to this technique being employed by my learned friend. The technique of reading to this witness an unsworn statement of another individual from a completely different unit, and then asking this witness whether similar things happened to him is not proper. It's an attempt to influence or guide the witness in a particular direction. The other statement has no relevance. My learned friend can ask this witness direct questions from his own experiences and from his own extensive statements. So that would be our objection.
Mr. President, with all due respect, that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm asking this witness about his experience. It is relevant. Mr. Heng Samrin participated in the liberation of Phnom Penh. He was in the Khmer Rouge army. Yesterday, we saw the prosecution trying to elicit from the witness statements as to what was Khmer Rouge policy. Clearly, it is relevant that another high-ranking division commander has received orders to not ask the population for anything. It at least begs the question whether or not this witness has received similar orders. I'm not making this up. This is in a statement that is part of the case file and on which, by the way, the prosecution wants to rely. Again, whether or not this witness received similar orders is relevant, and I would like the witness to answer this question.
President, the objection and its ground by the prosecution is grounded and sustained. Therefore, the defense counsel cannot use the interviews of other people as a basis for your question through a witness appearing before the chamber. However, you can put other questions related to the experience by the witness directly related to the relevant facts.
I am not sure I understand your ruling, Mr. President, so before I proceed, I would ask for clarification. Can we now not base questions on interviews that are part of the case file and that have an E3 number? Is this yet another refinement, excuse me, yet another refinement of the case law of this chamber?
President, Counsel Michael Canavas, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just wish to point out that in the past I have used the exact same technique with other witnesses where I was able to show statements and there was no objection by the prosecution and the trial chamber did allow that. So now it would appear that there is a different position being taken by the prosecution, a different ruling by the trial chamber, And frankly, not only is it confusing, but it is not in the interest of justice. Thank you.
The prosecution, you may proceed.
Mr. President, thank you. I just want to be clear for the record. We are certainly not objecting to defence using statements of other witnesses which relate to facts on which the witness before us is testifying. The reason I rose to object is because a fact was put to the witness that had nothing to do with his prior testimony. It related to life under the Khmer Rouge after the forced evacuations of the cities. There was no nexus with the evidence that this witness had been giving. The witness had not been asked anything about life and production after the fall of Phnom Penh. This was a completely new topic being explored by counsel. My objection was simply that it was not proper to start an examination of an entire new topic by reference to statements of other witnesses. So I want to be clear that we certainly do not object to counsel using statements of other witnesses that relate to facts on which this witness is testifying. It was a technique in this case that we found improper, and that was the reason for our objection.
President Judge Lavange, please take the floor in order to shed light on this issue.
Oui, merci.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. I believe what the Chamber would like to underscore here is that there was a problem in the manner in which the question was asked, in the way the reference was made to an interview of Mr. Samrin. That approach was not appropriate for asking the question because the witness had not been questioned. On that topic, statements by Mr. Hin Samrin are not related to this witness's testimony. So the witness answered a question as was asked to him on his knowledge. If the defense wishes to dwell on any inconsistencies observed through the testimony of this witness, they are free to do so.
The defense counsel, you may now proceed with your further questions.
Just to be sure that I understand, our position would be that we have in the statement of Mr. Heng Samrin clearly exculpatory position on under which orders the Khmer Rouge soldiers operated. Orders were to under no circumstances ask the population for anything. According to Mr. Heng Samrin, these plans came from the center, from high levels, and I am simply trying to verify whether those high-level orders were transmitted to the people much lower down, which would be Mr. Kung Kim. That's all I'm trying to do. So I would submit that is relevant. We're trying to establish whether the positive strategies by the Khmer Rouge leaders were actually transmitted to the lower down. So I would submit that we should be able to pursue that.
Judge Lavange, please take the floor.
Pardon. Il n'y a...
Pardon me. There is no objection to the question as such. You can ask the question, such questions. What we find strange is to use an assertion made by another witness at the very beginning of your questioning. If you find any inconsistencies subsequently, you may refer to another document in the case file. The relevance of the questions is not absolute. and you are free to change the type of questions you have to ask. Furthermore, we do not object to using documents in the case file to lay the foundation for your questions.
Thank you, Judge Lavergne. That clarifies things. Mr. Koen Kim, did you receive orders while you were in the army to not ask the population for anything and to support yourself?
When I was a soldier at the front battlefield, I did not receive such order as to not to ask for food from the people. The orders that I received were to attack the enemy and nothing else.
According to the excerpt I just read to you, in which Mr. Heng Samrin speaks about his experiences, he states that at that time we received plans from the center, from high levels, just to engage in production after liberation, to grow rice, to support ourselves, and under no circumstances to ask the population for anything. The army had to support itself. End of quote. And I remind you that Mr. Heng Samrin was a division commander at that time. Do you know whether or not your division commander, Mr. Un, received similar orders from the center, from high levels?
The plans prior to the attack on Phnom Penh was out of my grasp. Later on, when I stationed at my assigned sector, I knew about a plan that some soldiers were allowed to work in a rice field at Anlong Kangan. However, that was after the liberation of Phnom Penh, and I did not know about such a plan before the liberation of Phnom Penh.
Thank you. That is a clear answer. But my specific question was, do you know whether or not your division commander, Un, received orders similar to the ones that Mr. Heng Samrin claims to have received? If you don't know, that is perfectly fine.
I did not know, because that was the affairs of the division commander. I only knew that after Phnom Penh was liberated, there was an arrangement for a company to work in a rice field in Anlong Kangan.
Thank you for that answer. More generally speaking, and you have, excuse me, more generally speaking, and you have spoken about this already yesterday and today, but I want to make it clear. Did you, before or while entering Phnom Penh, ever receive written orders, or were these orders always transmitted orally?
During that time, the orders were not in writing. The transmission was through meeting, and it was done orally.
And before the liberation of Phnom Penh, while you were advancing on Phnom Penh, would you report it every time that you shot at a soldier? Would you report it to a superior, for example?
During the attack on Phnom Penh, at that time I was still quite young and I was a combatant, so I did not make any report to the upper echelon. The report was made by my superior.
And yesterday you told us, and I'm quoting from the transcript on page 77, trial day 123, the third line. Yesterday you stated, and I quote, "Upon receiving the order, I was in both the rear and the battlefields. I never met civilians. I only encounter soldiers. We clashed with the soldiers. We never saw civilians in the battlefields." And end of quote. Just to be clear, is that an accurate statement that you personally did not see civilians in the battlefields?
In the battlefield that we engaged in at the outskirts of Phnom Penh, there were various military barracks at the outside perimeters of the city, and there was no civilian at all. As for the soldiers, they were only present only by the arrangement, and there was no presence of the civilian, of any civilian at all.
And then when you enter the city, you have testified that you were charged with evacuating people from their houses. And I would like to read you a quotation from your statement to DC CAM. That is document number 19.96. And the English ERN is 00633875. And the Khmer ERN is 0005483. And you state in that interview, some people in the houses at that time even owned guns with an experience to use them. Some people shot at our soldiers first while we were climbing their house, and others threw hand grenades on us while we were walking on the street. End of quote. So here you speak about people in the houses at that time that even owned guns with an experience to use them. Could you tell us, were these people civilians? Were they soldiers? Or were they perhaps soldiers dressed as civilians? Or could you not tell the difference?
Regarding the grenade throwing that happened after the majority of the people had been evacuated, and there were those people who were living upstairs or on the upper floors, and based on the plans that I received from the upper echelon, that is from the platoon, that we had to clear those houses at the assigned sector, and those people who were there, they threw grenades at us. Of course, we did not see them. We only saw grenades being thrown at us. Then there was an order for us to go upstairs. and we saw that among those people, sometimes we saw a group of 3 or 4 people, and two among them would dress in military uniform, and the others would dress in civilian attire, and our order was to smash them.
So, is it a fair summary of your words to say that when you went up into those apartments, you could not tell for sure who had been throwing grenades at you? Is that what you're saying?
Response. After a grenade was thrown from up above at our soldiers, we identified the location of the apartment where the grenade was thrown as the location occupied by the enemies, and we received orders or instructions to contain the area and then searched the building for the people there.
And you have now specified your answer to those people throwing grenades. You have also stated, as I just quoted, that there were people in these houses that even owned guns with an experience to use them, and that some people shot at our soldiers first while we were climbing their house. Can you tell us who these people were that shot at you?
Response. Obviously, these people were soldiers. After the ceasefire, or when the fire stopped, other people who used to be soldiers remained soldiers, and fighting could still happen because some individuals would still take arms and exchange fires.
And as far as you experienced, those soldiers that were shooting at you, would they all be wearing uniforms, or had some of these soldiers changed to civilian clothing?
Response. After the people were smashed, they were in military uniforms.
And did you ever hear during that time about Lon Nol soldiers that took off their uniform and still continued to fight the Khmer Rouge?
Response. At my location, I did not remember seeing any Lon Nol soldiers who were wearing civilian clothes and fighting us. But indeed, there was incidents when the internal Khmer Rouge enemies wearing the leftover soldiers uniform by the Lon Nol soldiers, and then we could not identify one another and we mistakenly shot at each other.
Thank you for that answer. You also spoke yesterday about the practice when people were being evacuated, and I will quote from page 104 from the transcript, starting on the 8th line, which is time segment 15.25. 26.07. And your statement is the following, I quote, "The reality is that when the people were being evacuated, if there was no exchange fire from the other opponents or soldiers, then people would not be shot at. But if there fire from among the civilians, then there would be soldiers inside and we would be ordered to shoot at them. But if there were only pure civilians, then we were not ordered to shoot them." So, end of quote. Is it a fair summary of your answer to say that if there was fire coming from somewhere, then you would be ordered to shoot at them, but if there were only pure civilians, you would not be ordered to shoot at them?
Response. People got injured in the vicinity between Prek Phnom and Phnom Penh because these people were caught during the fire. And in Phnom Penh, we noted that the situation was chaotic. The movement was chaotic, but there was no fighting. And later on, a lot of people, almost the whole population of Phnom Penh, had been evacuated. During the evacuation, there was no gunfire or fighting, but then, after people had been moved, there was still more fighting.
And as you have testified before as well, you or your unit encountered former Lon Nol soldiers, and you have testified about this yesterday during questioning by the prosecution. And I quote from page 106, line 23. And your statement is, "When we got to Phnom Penh, soldiers who did not resist and agreed to go along with the people being evacuated, they were spared. But those who resisted, particularly those soldiers who were within the group, they did not retreat, so we had to shoot them." So, end of quote. You have also testified on this topic before the representatives of DC CAM, and that is document number 19.96. English ERN is 00633878, and Khmer ERN is 000543839. And on that page, you state, "Everyone had to leave, including the soldiers of the previous regime. As for the soldiers, if they took off their uniform, they would have a chance to live longer. But if they did not take off the uniform and resisted, they would be shot to death." Just to be clear on this issue, as far as your experience goes, when you encountered Lon Nol soldiers, they were given the chance to take off their uniform, and then they would be evacuated with the rest of the population. Is that what your experience was?
Response. During the time of the evacuation, I noted that people had to go through National Road number 5, and the population was mixed up with soldiers, monks, and other peoples. And for the soldiers who were still seen wearing uniforms would only be allowed to walk along with the whole population on the condition that they surrendered their arms. And we allowed them to make sure that everyone left Phnom Penh immediately.
And as far as you could tell, so based on your experience, was that the policy of the Khmer Rouge soldiers to surrender, to let the non-Nol soldiers surrender their arms and let them carry on their way?
Response. I do not know the upper echelon's policy concerning whether the soldiers were allowed to surrender their arms. But for us, the orders were very precise that as long as the people in uniform were armed and did not surrender their arms, they were subject to be shot at. But if they surrendered their arms, they could mingle with the population and move on.
Thank you for that answer. Today, you already spoke about what people could bring along with them. You've been brief about it, so I want to ask you a follow-up question. In your experience, could people transport their personal belongings if they desired to do so?
Response. I saw that it was the case that people could carry with them their belongings, including jewelry or money, except guns.
And did you see people carrying other belongings than jewelry or money? Did you see that they were free to bring other belongings with them?
Response. During the evacuation, what I saw was that people were forced to leave the city, and indeed people did not volunteer to leave the city, so many had to carry their belongings, whatever they could grab at that time. Some would have to push the carts carrying their luggages, and some would have to go with their vehicles and other means of transportation.
Thank you, that is clear. Another topic that was briefly discussed this morning is the following. You talked about the fact that the city was divided into different areas after the liberation of Phnom Penh. Would you know into how many different areas Phnom Penh was divided after the liberation?
Response. It is true to say that Phnom Penh was divided into several sections, but I have no idea how many and which zone controlled which sections, because I was in charge of just a small block and I could not even understand whether the other groups would be occupying other blocks, and I had no knowledge of this other than the confined area where I took control.
And to be clear on this issue, the area that you controlled with your units after the liberation, was that the same area that you searched with your units during the evacuation on Phnom Penh?
Response. When it comes to the evacuation, the division was in charge of the geographical location and division of labor. And for us, we were in charge of the small block, and indeed it was our task to make sure that the people were evacuated from this area we controlled.
I think you've answered my question, but just to be sure, I will repeat it once more in slightly different form. The area that you controlled with your units after the liberation of Phnom Penh, this small area that you did not leave, according to your statements, is that the same area that you searched on April 17 and the days following April 17? Or was that perhaps a different section of the city?
Response. When in Phnom Penh, our squads under the platoon did not receive any orders to evacuate the people as yet. But we noted that people were on the move already. People could be seen walking in all directions. But then, at that moment, we were told or ordered to help control the crowds. In particular, control the crowds who were passing our area. But then we had another plan. This plan was rendered to us only after the majority of the people already had left the city, and this next plan is to clean or to make sure that the last person is leaving.
Thank you. That clarifies things. When you were in this section of the city that was controlled by your unit, you've called it your own parameter. Why was it not possible for you to leave that small part of the city?
Response. There was an order. There was a strict order that wherever we remained, we had to remain in that area. If we were to step outside that confined area, we would be accused of being ill-disciplined and accused of being disobeying the order.
And how many soldiers were within this small section of the city that you could not leave? I know you've spoken about it before, but I would like to get a specific answer.
Response. The soldiers who came to Phnom Penh in my own group, the number has been reduced to only 7 people. The rest already perished during the fighting, and we had to control the area from Wat Phnom to the north, and 3 groups were in charge of controlling these blocks, and only the superiors would be allowed to move from one place to another, but soldiers like us had to be in the same place at all time.
And you've spoken about guarding these blocks. Could you give us an estimate as to how many blocks we are speaking about? If you cannot, that is no problem.
Response. For the task rendered by the company to the platoon, we were pointed the geographical location, for example, from which juncture of the road to which particular area. So we indeed occupy several blocks.
You mentioned that you occupied several blocks, but could you try to be a bit more specific as to the number of blocks your unit was guarding?
Response. I note that the blocks under our supervision were rather very small, and I belong to the whole division, but the division is divided into different portions, including the smaller part as small as the platoon and the squad. So our squad was in control of even smaller confined area.
And you just stated that your superiors were allowed to move freely. Do you know whether the chairman of your division, Mr. Un, was allowed to move freely in that part of the city that his division stayed in?
Response. Through my experience working for Division 310, which I received the pass, the travel permit as well, and we had to also, I knew that Mr. Eun could be traveling across the whole areas, but the only thing I knew was that whenever he had to pass our block, the area we control, then I would be able to know and help him, coming through.
So you say that Mr. Un was free to travel. Do you know whether he was free to travel in the city of Phnom Penh, or was he free to travel only in the section of the city that was controlled by his division, Division 310?
Response. The commander of the division could travel to different places. However, I do not know to what extent he could feel free to travel, because my task was, as I indicated, to station at one location, and I believe that he could have been traveling to attend meetings or meet other people elsewhere, but that's just my guess. So I may say that I don't know.
Thank you for being that specific. That is very helpful. And indeed, we do not want you to guess. You say that you were confined to the section that your unit guarded. Did you have any idea what was happening in Phnom Penh outside the section that you were guarding?
Response. I received orders to stand guards days and nights. I was never informed of any other situation, for example, what happened outside this confined area. So I was learning only about my duty, which is to stand guard. And at night, I would only see people like head of the platoon or company who would be coming to inspect the guards who perhaps dozed off during the time when they are on duty.
So, is the fair summary of your words to say that you had very limited knowledge as to what was happening in Phnom Penh as a whole?
Response. It is true to say so, that at that time I was very young. I was about 16 and 17 years old, and the position I held was very low, and with that I could not be supposed to know what happened or whether there were any plans by the superior. I only knew what I supposed to know at that time as in my capacity.
Thank you. And I am sorry that I am returning to the issue, but I have a question remaining as to what exactly you did when you entered Phnom Penh, and then more specifically, I'm interested to know in which region of Phnom Penh you were operating when you entered Phnom Penh on April 17. And I'm going to try to make it slightly more specific for you to see if I can make myself more clear in this way. You have stated, Mr. Kun Kim, that your unit was in charge of guarding several small blocks of buildings north of Wat Phnom. When you entered Phnom Penh on April 17, and when you helped with the evacuation of Phnom Penh, did that take place around or in the neighborhood of these small blocks of buildings north of Wat Phnom.
Response. I already testified that during the early 3 days when we came to Phnom Penh, I did not engage in the evacuation of the people. I saw them being evacuated for sure, but there was no plan rendered to us to help evacuate the people. Our task at that time was to move to our location as soon as possible. And after that, after the people had already been left, we were tasked with cleaning, with removing the remaining people who still remained in their houses and apartments. And that we were informed that some people were still hiding in the apartments and they did not want to leave. So with that, we received the order to cut the water supply and to make sure people frustrated and had to come down and leave.
That makes it a lot clearer again. And just one follow-up question to make sure we fully understand. You stated that on April 17 and the days after, your task was to get to your location as soon as possible. When you speak about that location, are you speaking about that section of the city that you later guarded, this small section with several blocks of buildings north of Wat Phnom?
Response. When I approached Phnom Penh, the arrangement was made by the company and we were pointed to the location where we would station. And again, during the chaotic situation of the evacuation, I was not engaged in helping moving all the population out of the city. I was only tasked with making sure that I and the group in the squad moved to the location as indicated immediately. And during these early 3 days, we did not receive any order to evacuate the population. And the plan to evacuate the city was indeed rendered by the upper echelon to other section other than our squad or battalion. The President intervenes. Council, thank you very much. And Mr. Witness, we also thank you, but it is now appropriate moment for the lunch adjournment. The Chamber will adjourn until 1:30 p.m. Court officer is now instructed to assist the witness and his jury counsel during the adjournment and have him return to the courtroom by 1:30 p.m. Counsel for Mr. Nguyen Chia, you remain standing and you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Our client, Mr. Nguyen Chia, would like to follow this afternoon's proceedings from his holding cell as he is suffering from a headache, back pain and a lack of concentration, and we have the waiver and we will submit it to the greffier.
The President, the Chamber notes the request by Mr. Nguyen Chia through his counsel, in which he has requested that he be excused and allowed to observe the proceedings from his holding cell due to his health concerns. The Chamber therefore grants such request. Mr. Nuon Chea is now allowed to observe the proceedings from his holding cell for the remainder of the day, and that the Chamber notes Mr. Nuon Chea has expressly waived his right to participate directly in the court room, and the Chamber would like counsels for Mr. Nuon Chea to submit the waiver by Mr. Nuon Chea, given thumbprint or signed by him to the Chamber in due course. AV unit is now instructed to ensure that the AV equipment is well connected to the holding cell so that Mr. Nuon Chea can observe the proceedings from there for the remainder of the day. And security personnel are now instructed to bring Mr. Nuon Chea and Khieu Samphan to their respective holding cell and have Mr. Khieu Samphan return to the courtroom by the afternoon session when we resume.
សូមអញ្ជើញក្រោកឈរ